This is a production of Cornell University.
Good. So thank you very much for coming. I'm not sure if you're here for the food or you're here to listen to me, but I'm going to talk to you about my favorite topic. It's something which, when I started working in Pakistan, I kept hearing this from the extension people: the more you till, the higher the yield. And ever since then, I've been trying to find out why, if you don't do no-till, you actually have higher yields. So hopefully that's the message today. So let's see. How do we get these things to actually? Okay, so this is just a brief outline. I want to remind everybody about what the future challenges are for agriculture in the future, because a lot of you in this room are going to be working on this in the future. So I'm retired. I've done my bit. So then I want to look at the history and benefits, the problems and consequences of tillage, the importance of soil health. I think this is something which is going to be really important for future agriculture. I want to look at the definition of no-till and conservation agriculture. There are some new definitions which I want to just show you. What are some of the benefits of conservation agriculture? And then I want to show you, well, how did I get into this in the first place? And then I've got a website. What have I been doing since I retired? Okay, what is life like after Cornell? Essentially. So I like to do this. I do this in my the classes that I used to teach here. We need to increase food production. We have to do it in a sustainable way, and it has to meet both food and nutritional food security, because we have a growing population. Okay, maybe not in the US, maybe not in China, but we do have in other parts of the world. And at the same time, we must minimize the effects on the environment. And what I think is really important is improving the livelihoods of those involved in agriculture. Maybe not so much in the US, because you only have a small percentage of people involved in agriculture. But if you go to India, for example, you've got 20 million farmers. And how do we also improve their livelihoods? Essentially, the way to do that is to improve the efficiency. As this is an agronomist, I'm an agronomist. I'm not an economist, not a social scientist. I'm an agronomist. Improve the efficiency of the natural resource use needed for agricultural production. How do we improve fertilizer efficiency? How do we do this? And we have to do this at a time when demand for food is increasing. We already have areas of food insecurity, and even more now because of what happened with COVID. The harvested area per capita is diminishing. In other words, we have to produce more from a smaller area. Traditional sources of productivity are already being used. Farmers are using improved varieties. They're using fertilizer. They're using irrigation. They're using mechanization, etc. There's competition for water. This is a big issue. Future oil prices. We saw the spike that we had not long ago. I think in the future, they're going to become even more so. And that has a big impact on the cost of inputs. Climate change, we're seeing this. I'm glad I don't live in California, where you have this problem there. There's already resource, environmental, and land degradation. The dietary changes, for example, in India, a lot of people in India would be vegetarian, but now they like to eat meat and chicken, etc. And then biofuel competing for agricultural land, and more. I'm sure there are more. So I suggest that business as usual will not get the job done. So what are we going to do about that? So I wanted to start with that statement. So let's talk a little bit about the history of tillage. Essentially, when hunter-gatherers decided to be more sedentary. They would essentially plant their crops with a simple planting stick, make a hole in the ground, put some seeds in, and whatever comes up was fine. And then around 4000 BC, the farmers started using livestock, manual power, manpower, with simple plows and tools to produce their food. I put the Three Sisters up there because the Three Sisters was probably one of the first conservation agriculture practices that you see. And you all know what the Three Sisters is. But it's essentially they make mounds and then they plant corn and intercrop with corn and legumes and squash or pumpkins. But they don't plow it again. They come back and use that as a no-till system. Plows were to invert soil, 17th century, 19th century, steam-powered tractors, early 20th gasoline with steel plow and rubber wheels, and then modern tractors, which we have today. Not that one. So why do people do tillage? Well, these are some of the reasons. Weed control is one of the big ones. Uprooting, removing, or burying. You could uproot and remove by hand, or you could do it with a hoe, or you could do it with the tillage. Oxidation of organic matter and release of nutrients. So when you plow the soil, you oxidize the organic matter, and this releases nutrients, which is really important. Make the surface friable for planting or transplanting. And here's an example of rice. I'm a rice agronomist and a wheat agronomist. Puddling the rice for soil. Puddling is where you plow the soil when it's wet. You form a plow pan, impound the water, which then helps control weeds and also soften the soil for transplanting. But this is some of the consequences of tillage. This is from Brazil. Poor tillage practices. You see this erosion, and essentially your topsoil and nutrients are going downstream or out to the ocean. Here's some other consequences of this. The one down here shows these this is a lot of the topsoil, and that's getting into the Gulf of Mexico. And then, of course, the big example of the problem for tillage is Dust Bowl. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. But can you imagine being a farmer living in that house on the left when this happened? So what we have is essentially you increase tillage. You release nutrients, but you have a decline in organic. You don't put organic matter into the soil. This affects the microbial communities. Okay. So you reduce soil aggregation, poor drainage, you get compaction, and then you till again. So you get this spiral of okay, so now I can't move. So this is the sort of a downward spiral of poor soil health with tillage. And it's not something that happens overnight, but over a long period of time, you see this degradation. So is tillage really necessary? Or, as this person says, are we just burning our money and releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? So let's talk a little bit about soil health. And this FAO book that's listed here, Save and Grow. Can you hear me?
You can hold this closer.
So this book at the bottom, Save and Grow, has a lot of really good information. But essentially, agriculture must learn to return to its roots by rediscovering the importance of healthy soil. Drawing on natural sources of plant nutrition and using mineral fertilizer wisely. And then there's a statement there, I won't spend time on it, but essentially a healthy soil. I have some slides I want to show on that. So the importance of soil health. And this was the director of USDA in 2019. He says, when we restore the soil, we see an improvement in quantity and quality of food. And then the whole goal is to take agriculture to the next level. And this will require creative solutions and collaboration between everyone touched in agriculture. So if you look at a degraded soil, this is some of the properties, soil physical properties, problems of water infiltration, more pathogens, nutrient deficiencies, etc. Whereas a healthy soil be higher in organic matter and has some of the opposite effects of what you see on the left. So a forest soil, for example, where you have, it's not disturbed and it has leaf mulch or it has mulches on the ground. This is what you find with if you sample a forest soil. But the one on the left, intensively mined agricultural soil, no organic amendments, essentially. And I have this just says, you know, no addition of organic matter. With the Green Revolution, it worked really well for a while until you decrease the organic matter in the soil. That affected the soil biology, etc. And so what we need is a combination of both organic matter and chemical fertilizer. So this is on this side, present farming practices. Now, I'm not just talking about the US, I'm talking about global. My experience is mostly in South Asia. And this is healthy soil using organic amendments, minimal soil disturbance, and some of these other important things, rotations. So I will be talking about conservation agriculture. And if we go through soil biological diversity, I think if any of you have taken Janice's course, you've already gone through this. And if you haven't taken it, take it, because it's really going to be important in the future. But essentially, what you're trying to do is improve the biodiversity of the soil in terms of microbes. And a healthy soil has more microbes than an unhealthy soil. I also have a video called Life in the Soil, which I like to look at. When I saw that video, it was done by a Japanese group, I began to understand why this was so important. It was something that was going on below the soil surface. You couldn't see it, but it was really important. Okay. And what I'm going to hypothesize is that conservation agriculture, which I'm going to describe soon, plays a critical role in below ground diversity and disease and pest suppression. So the big question is, you can talk about it. And in fact, Cornell, our Department of Soils and Crop Science has a really excellent program on soil health, and you can measure it. But how do you improve it? So that's the question, how do you improve soil health? And I want to just go back to a little bit on sustainable crop production intensification, the Green Revolution paradigm, high soil disturbance, modern high yield varieties, high purchased input use, and we got good, higher yields and higher output. It helped to essentially prevent famines that occurred in the 30s and 40s and 50s. You don't hear as many of these famines as you do today. The downside is that there was pollution, farmers used too much fertilizer, reduced efficiency, loss of soil health, erosion, and side effects. So what we really need to be doing in the future is sustainable intensification paradigm. I use the word responsible because I can't always define what sustainability is, but I can define to you what I think is responsible. Strengthen soil health and natural processes to boost production. and environmental services, avoid waste, input use only as much as the system can take, and improve the efficiency of natural resources. There are a number of new definitions. Everybody seems to want to have a new definition every year, or every 2 or 3 years you get a new definition. So climate smart agriculture came out about 10 years ago. Regenerative agriculture is there now, agroecological farming. I'm not going to spend time on this. There is a link on my program which will take you to these definitions. And there are others. All I contend is that if you're talking about soil health and you're talking about from an agronomic point of view, conservation agriculture would be involved somewhere in all three of those. They never mention it, but that's what they do. So let's talk about mechanized no-till. The Dust Bowl, use of inversion tillage, led to what happened is that the scientists and the soil scientists came up with the term conservation tillage. Conservation tillage was reduced tillage with a chisel plow, and stubbles were left on the soil surface, about 30%. So that was the beginning of no-till, beginning of conservation agriculture, the forerunner of no-tillage farming. 1943, I'm not sure that our Dutch friend is here today, but he always in his class talks about Plowman's Folly. This book is in the library if you want to read it. No one has ever advanced a scientific reason for plowing. Okay, there's simply no need for plowing in the first instance. And most of the operations that customarily follow the plowing are entirely unnecessary if the land has not been plowed. There's nothing wrong with our soil except our interference. So this is I'd like to use this as to say, hey, think about it. Don't reject no-till. 2,4-D herbicide that came out in 1940s helped to control weeds. A lot of people say, well, no-till, you have a weed problem, so it doesn't work. Well, that's a good opportunity for weed scientists to find solutions on how to resolve the weed problem. Research and testing of no-till in all continents from 1960 to 2000, and limited scaling with farmers in 1980s and 1990s. Okay, so it's not very far away, it's still in my lifetime. And by 2000, there was about 65 million hectares of no-till cropland systems in the world. Now I want to switch over to conservation agriculture. I call this an ecosystem approach to regenerative sustainable agriculture. From 1970 to 97, there was a lot of farmer experimentation, a lot of research being done in various parts of the world to define what are the key components of a sustainable no-till system. In 1997, meeting in Mexico, these two people, very well known in the conservation from FAO, came up with the definition, conservation agriculture. So we're talking about 1998. That's not too long ago. And essentially what the three pillars of conservation agriculture is little or no soil disturbance, okay, no till, or just enough to get the seed into the soil. Permanent soil cover, that's really important. And this can be residues of the previous crop, or it can be cover crops. And I should also point out that conservation agriculture, no-till, and cover crops is becoming a big thing to get into, importance to farmers in this. And they provide some of the things. Don't burn the residue, okay? The easiest thing to do is to get a box of matches and pile up some of the straw and light it. And the next thing you know, everybody's having to wear masks, not for COVID, but because of air pollution. And then crop rotation and later the diversity of crops. Now, what you find is that some farmers just do one of those. They might just do no-till. Some of them realize afterwards that no-till plus cover crops plus or residue, leaving residues is really important. And I'm going to show you some slides on that. And then rotation may come in later on. Okay, so a lot of people criticize, well, conservation, you know, they only do one of these, so therefore conservation is no good. So, and this is one of the sources. This is in a new journal called Agronomy, not the American Society of Agronomy journal, experiences and lessons from conservation agriculture. So they have this picture. You can see the Dust Bowl in 1930. So around 1950, 1970, you see this big increase in conservation agriculture or no-till agriculture to where in 2020, we're over 200 million hectares of no-till in the world at the moment, okay? And 2022, it's probably up around 220. And where is that? Here, the data. One of the big problems with getting data on conservation agriculture is not collected by the national programs. So you have to find other ways of getting this information. But you can see the main areas in South and Central America, mostly Brazil, Argentina, are very big no-till countries. And you can see the changes that have occurred since 2008-9 in the third column, and then how much of percentage of the CA area in the region in 2018-19. Some of them are still fairly small. Look what happened in Ukraine. It was very small in 2008, but it became much bigger in 2018. 6 million hectares. Of course, it's probably none there at the moment. So. But I want to also raise this, that it doesn't solve all problems. It's no panacea. It's just a way of helping to improve. Don't forget all of the other modern or good activities that are needed for producing food. Things like good genetic stock, good potential, good these things. Integrated, in other words, minimum soil disturbance, soil cover, and crop diversity are not. You need to also do all these other things. Integrated approaches to pest management, nutrient management, weed management, etc. Mechanization, permanent bed and furrows. By the way, conservation agriculture can be done on the flat, or it can be done on beds, or it can be done in basins. So sustainable crop production aims to maximize options for crop production and intensification while minimizing the effect on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Yeah, and we also need to think of livestock in here as well. So no tillage, it's called many things in different parts of the world. So in Brazil, it might be Siembra directa, but it's a rapidly growing practice in the world. But notice the residue cover. The residue cover is one of the most important aspects of this. Some of the benefits, I've listed a lot of them there. I've highlighted increased soil biological activity, erosion, infiltration of water. There's a number of things there. But I think the last one, reduced labor and costs, are the main things that motivate farmers to experiment with this technology. Okay, because one of the important things with any technology, the farmers have to adopt it if it's going to have any impact on food security. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that today, but how do you get farmers to practice this? It's very easy to take a bag of seed and say, hey, this is a better variety. That's very simple, but try doing it with a technology like a complex technology like this. So I wanted to show this picture. This is in Australia. Left-hand side, no-till, right-hand side, conventional, right? Notice there's 35% more infiltration of water on the left-hand side. It's counterintuitive, right? You do tillage so you get better infiltration of water. Well, actually, the textbooks are wrong on that. On the right-hand side, see how that water's ponding? And what's happening is that water's running off and causing the problems of topsoil loss. But notice the residue is still there on the left-hand side. And if you look at the same field at harvest time, on the left-hand side, you see the no-till maize. And on the right-hand side, you see where the conventional tillage. So we actually have a maize crop and some yield on the left-hand side and zero yield maize on the right-hand side. And it's all due to essentially infiltration of water, and this was just drought stress. And I've got the same thing from CIMMYT. I worked at CIMMYT, Wheat and Maize Center, no-till plus residue, and this is a long-term trial. So this is maybe after 10 years or 15 years of doing no-till and residue in this plot. And this is without residue. No-till, same no-till, but this is without residue. So you really need that residue to help with the surface, to allow infiltration of water, to work with the soil biology, etc. And the same thing happens on wheat. This is no-till. Without residue, this is till. Now, no-till without residue, what they did is they burnt the residue. So burning a residue is not a good idea. So sometimes people say, well, no-till is no good. See, look, you get lower yields. Well, it takes time to get this. Let me see. And no-till does not equal conservation agriculture. You need the residue. So here's a picture of soybeans in Brazil after wheat. Here's another picture from Zambia, where a graduate student from our department went there. And what you see down here is, let's see, down the base of the maize plots, they've actually dug a basin. And in that basin, they put some organic matter in, and they planted maize, but they could also plant intercrop with some legumes as well. And what we recommended is that after they harvest this, is don't dig those again, but make them permanent basins. And therefore, all of the improvements in the soil quality. And this is a practice from North Africa. It's the Zai system in Burkina Faso. It's a traditional system. So small or big farms can do this. Tractor to manual or animal power, mono or mixed cropping. Trees can be added, irrigated or rain-fed, flat or raised bed planting, basins or mounds, depending on whether you have a problem with drainage. The Three Sisters is an example of a mound system. Here's a picture in East Africa of these trees being put in. And this is a leguminous tree. Some of the farmers will actually lop off some of the branches and use that as fertilizer. So you talk, what about resource farmers? You know, average farm size in India is about 1 hectare, a couple of acres. How do these? They can't afford to have a tractor. How are they going to do this work? They have these various things. They don't have enough money, lack of income. They don't want to take the risk associated with new technology. What we recommend is the use of service providers, and this is what has happened in India and some of these countries. Service provider, you take a young person, provide him with the equipment that he needs, and then he comes to the farmers and essentially does the no-till and the residue into the residue for that farmer. He may even be able to provide some of the inputs and some of the things for a fee. And in fact, a lot of the farmers in South Asia would do their plowing that way. A farmer who had a tractor in the village would do the first plowing or the second plowing. And they did it on the same. So who were the biggest opponents for no-till when we went into South Asia? were those farmers that had tractors that got income from the tillage. But we soon convinced them to actually switch over. When I say we, I meant the national programs and the scientists and the people that we work with. Okay. The other thing which is really important is that you need an innovation network to get the adoption. You need to local manufacturing, local machinery makers and developers, public sector extension and universities, non-government extension groups, scientists, innovative farmers, credits, etc., etc. This doesn't work, so let me take this off. So you need a really, this has to be developed at the same time. So you see, it's not a simple thing. It's not something which you can come in with a bag of technology and say, okay, now adopt this. You have to get all of these actors involved and stakeholders. And the way we did it in South Asia is by having what we call champions in their country who were able to get all of this thing happening. Policy and institutions is also really important. This comes from the same Save and Grow book from FAO. To encourage smallholders to adopt sustainable crop production, fundamental changes are needed in development policies and institutions. And there's a list of some of the things. It has to be profitable to the farmers. Otherwise, they're not going to benefit from it. And also the enabling factors need to be in place to allow farmers to experiment with new ideas. So let's go back to when I first got into Pakistan. Okay, that was in the 1980s. And this is a graph that shows the importance of planting date, right? So if you look at this, there's a sort of a optimal planting date. This is wheat following rice, wheat following rice. And you can see that about November 15th is the best date for planting. Plant a little bit earlier, you have problems with it being too hot. If you plant late, what happens is that the plants, the wheat matures at a time when the heat increases and you get shriveling of grains and lower yields. By planting on time, you can escape that heat stress. And of course, heat stress is going to be more important with climate change in the future. We now, we could say the national program breeders, plant breeders, have now got varieties of wheat that can be planted as early as the end of October without yield loss. And so therefore have higher yields. So we did a diagnostic survey in this area. We were getting low yields. Farmers were planting their wheat in December and even in early January. And so late planting reduces wheat yield. That was the main thing. And there were several reasons. One of the reasons was, well, the previous crop got harvested late, or they grew another crop before they planted wheat, or they had long duration varieties. So there's a number of factors. Some of those you can take care of, change the rice varieties, although that's not so easy, and etc. Then below, but one of the big things was the long turnaround time from when rice was harvested and wheat was planted. And the reason for that was excessive tillage. Some farmers actually plowed 20 times because the soils were had very poor structure, and they needed to, they wanted to turn it into talcum powder for planting. And that got rid of a lot of the moisture, or there was too much moisture. Or they would thresh the rice before they wanted to do this plowing, or there were power constraints, okay? So that's where we came up with, what, why do they do like tillage? Can you imagine plowing with a bullock and a wooden plow and having to walk up and down the field 20 times to get tillage? You can imagine how much. So we had a New Zealand manufacturer of equipment come to Pakistan. And one of the key components was this coulter, this opener, inverted T opener. And you see what they did is the local manufacturers were able to put this opener on their drills. They could then plant into the residue and apply both seed and fertilizer. So you had better distribution of fertilizer, more efficient use of fertilizer. And this was good for fields that harvested by hand. So when in the 1980s, a lot of the rice fields were harvested by hand. Okay, so then you had anchored straw, and this didn't cause any problems. But then as the 90s, 2000s came along, people started to have service providers doing combine harvesting. Combine harvesting was leaving a lot of loose residue on the surface. So this system didn't work. But then the engineers in that area said, okay, well, how do we overcome that? And here's a simple, John Blackwell from Australia came up. You can see the no-till drill at the back and the back here. And what this does, picks up the straw. You plant in where there's no loose residue, and then the straw is put back down on the soil surface. Okay. So what about the US? Well, a couple of things. There's a lot of farmers and a lot of organizations in the US that are now doing no-till. And this no-till farmer magazine is something which you might like to look at. And in this magazine, you also see manufacturers of some of the implements for working on cover crops or residues, loose residues in that area. In a place like South Asia, in India and China, there's a lot of local manufacturers of equipment. So you see in California, there's a lot of conservation agriculture now being practiced there. A lot of cover crops being used there. So it's growing, okay? This is what we want to prevent. You may have heard about in New Delhi, you could hardly breathe. You had to stay inside your house because it got so thick with smoke that it was dangerous for your health. And also a lot of that residue would fall on the glaciers up in the Himalayas and increase the albedo to where the snow actually melts faster now than it did before. So how do we overcome this? Well, we think no-till is the way to go, and leave that residue on the ground as your residue cover. Okay, so what have I done since 2015? I retired in 2015. I can't believe it was 7 years ago. But when you retire, it doesn't mean to say you become a couch potato, okay? So what I've been doing is I curate and maintain a conservation agriculture website with Lucy Fisher. I'll see if I can get this one to work. This is my website. If you look at this website, if you go to here, you look at the full research database. This is what I spend most of my time on at the moment. You've all used Zotero. And in Zotero, if you go to the conservation agriculture articles, yeah. I have 2,870 articles now in that database, and I'm adding to them every month. It's incredible how much research has been done in this particular field at the moment. And I also have keywords. I have the DOI number. I have the articles there if you need to get them, but you can find them at Cornell. So I think I better stop there so we can have some questions. I also put out a newsletter, and some of you get my newsletter, Scoop It newsletter, where I pick the best articles every month and send it out to listservs and to various people. Okay?
Question. Yeah. The obvious question is, what about the plant diseases. What about the plant pathology? You talk about weed control, but isn't that a serious problem with the residue?
Well, one of the interesting things is that that's what you would expect, right?
It's what I do expect.
That's what you expect. But actually, what you find is that if you can increase the biological diversity in the soil, those organisms actually can help control some of the parasitic organisms. Okay, so talk to the people in Australia, talk to the people where this is happening. You do see cases of where you have more disease, more wheat diseases, for example, in some fields.
I was thinking of rusts and smuts and things like that.
Rust is not one I would worry about. The rust is one that is carried from the air, and it's in, you know, that's why you have to use good germplasm and plant. You're going to have rust diseases. But then, you know, one of the interesting things about the Green Revolution was that the varieties that were developed by Simmet or by Norman Borlaug and that had very, very good rust resistance. And that's why. So you use integrated disease management, use varieties that have resistance to that. But it's not something you can ignore. Oh, I agree. Yeah. Yes.
I was just going to ask a follow-up question. I might hypothesize, and I wonder if you had experience with this, the disease issue, which I think comes up a lot with residues. Do you think that might interact with the moisture regime and how the moisture changes over time with climate change? Like in upstate New York, maybe in California right now, if you have a lot of water on that residue, you might have a very different condition than maybe in Australia, where maybe most of the time it's dry. I would imagine the microbes would behave very differently in the two systems with residue.
Yeah, there's a lot of articles in the database that I have that look at that. One of the interesting things when you have the residue and do no-till is you get much better infiltration of water. You actually have more water sitting and ponding on the surface with tillage. And so then you would have certain diseases that would come up. So when you see 200 million hectares, it's obviously, you know, I don't think it's as big a problem as you think. But if it is a problem, then you need to then have a plant pathologist in your program, and you must use integrated disease management as part of that. So don't ignore that. If you have a weed problem, you need to look at integrated weed management rather than just use a herbicide. Yeah. Yes.
Are there any instances, be it regions or particular crops, where this would not be appropriate and would not be recommended in the no-till or conservation system?
I don't think so. One of the big challenges is if you start looking at rice. But the problem with rice is that when you do the puddling and you do the transplanting, first of all, it uses a lot of water. It destroys the soil physical properties of the soil, may have some impact on other properties of the soil. And it's a very labor intensive and costly. So a lot of farmers are now having problems finding people to do the transplanting or do the puddling. And then the crop that follows that puddled soil is not very good. So there's a movement to go to direct seeded rice, right? When you go to direct seeded rice, the first challenge you have are weeds. So you have to overcome the weed problem. But what we're finding, when I say we, what is happening in the national programs, I left 20 years ago. They are coming up with solutions using integrated weed management to overcome that problem. So even rice, if you have rice no-till followed by wheat no-till, you have a much healthier soil and a much higher yields. But there are problems. There are problems of phosphorus. There are problems of some of these other nutrients. So you need integrated nutrient management. I don't see any reason why you don't have to do intensive tillage. I think you can do away with minimal tillage. So, yeah.
Right, yeah. Just looking ahead a little bit. So there's about 2.5 petagrams of carbon, which is increasingly going to become demanded for climate change mitigation, for any biofuels based biochar. It's just going to increasingly seen as a resource. I was just wondering if there's any ways to actually be able to harvest that as a resource and still get some of the benefits of residue retention and the other aspects of conservation agriculture, or do you see that as just no hope to be able to do that and maintain that benefit?
It's possible. I do see with the no-till, first of all, not burning the diesel for the land preparation. You're also finding with the mulch on the surface that you're increasing the organic matter in the soil. There's a lot of papers now that show that you increase.
So my question was, but if you don't leave that on, so when you take that resource and convert it to biofuels or use it in bioenergy storage, then you haven't got that mulch anymore. So you're using other.
Well, I don't think that you should be growing biofuels on agricultural land. That's a whole other story. There is the whole issue of carbon credits for this, but I don't see how, when you've got 20 million smallholder farmers in India, how you're going to get payments for carbon sequestration. But that's something that you're in that area, and so you got to keep your job, and the other students associated with you that can look at that issue. All I'm saying is that we have a big problem with the tillage system that we have. Yeah, Howard.
So I used to add on to that, in many places in South Asia, you see that, for example, you start either burning the residue because economic
It's simple
reasons, and but also a lot of times the residue is fed to an animal, cow typically, because farm families have cows, and then the cow pies are used actually as a biofuel, as for cooking. And so in those scenarios, you're not seeing the carbon go back. In both those scenarios, carbon does not go back to the soil. And so when you sometimes look at, say, a long-term experiment that is based on the ideal system where the residue goes back, and then you look at practice where a lot of farmers remove the residue and nothing goes back, those are very different situations. No-till without the residue is very different and much inferior to the no-till with the residue. So the residue management is also very key.
And you have to be aware of the fact that farmers have animals and they need to be fed. So you have this competition. But can you come up with something where you have some of the residues go to feed your animals and some of it goes to feed the soil? So I mean, it's not. It's a very complex issue. Yes, you have a question.
Yeah, in South America, many farmers that were doing no-till for 10 years are now going into adaptation tillage because they were having some production problems, and some people saying that this will help with carbon separation surface and improve the nutrient certification as well. Do you have any comments about additional?
What I've heard is not that. I've heard farmers that said, I've tried rotational tillage, but found I didn't need it. And they continue with no-till. But once again, I can't be everywhere. So that's something to look at. I think with no-till, with residue retention, you actually have less subsoil hard pans and compaction. The compaction comes when you do tillage. Yeah. So you're from there. Go and talk to some of the farmers there and ask them. Some farmers down there have been doing it for 30, 40 years. And what the farmers say there, the biggest problem was this in adopting it, the mind. Your fathers say, the more you till, the higher the yield. My grandfather did it. So, but now they do it. Now, the big problem is that they're now they have been using herbicide tolerant crops like soybeans and maize with glyphosate and that. And so there are some issues in that respect. So,
Thank you very much, Peter.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.